Today is Thursday, November 21st, 2013, and this is Stephen Fagin, the Associate Curator at the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. And the interview that we're doing today is part of the museum's ongoing oral history project. And ma'am, at the beginning of these, we always ask our guests to get us started with their full name, date and place of birth, and just a little personal background about themselves.
Well, my full name, it's a very long one. It's Mary Elizabeth Ann Woodward Pillsworth. And I was born in San Angelo, Texas. I live in upstate New York and in Mexico now.
Okay. Well, I want to start with President Kennedy because I understand he was the first president you voted for. Tell me a little bit about his appeal.
Well, I had been interested in politics since I was 12 years old. I worked in my first campaign at age 12. And I was just typical of my generation. I was a Kennedy kid. And there were millions of us, and we loved him. He just was, it was like he, in the first place, he was one of us. He wasn't that much older. And we really believed he offered a future that was something that was very appealing to us. And I was just really very typical of a whole generation of what they called Kennedy kids. And I had, when I was in college, I had been an officer in both students for Kennedy and my Young Democrats, and I actually attended the 1960 Democratic National Convention, and I had a front row seat for his acceptance speech in the Los Angeles Coliseum.
Wow. We remember Kennedy today from Life magazine and from largely black and white news footage. What about him, being in his presence, what about him stood out to you physically?
Well, he was just very charismatic, and you got the feeling that he really was passionate about his ideas and about what he wanted for the future of the country, and that he really, it was like, it really was passing the torch to a new generation, and we felt we were that new generation, so that was a lot of appeal.
Did Jackie hold equal appeal for you?
Well, of course we were fascinated with Jackie, especially us females, because she was just, you know, we all wanted to be a Jackie Kennedy, and I had never seen her before. I had met Jack Kennedy on 3 separate occasions, so I very likely would not have even bothered gone down to see a motorcade with him in it, but she was going to be there, and I'd never seen her before, so that was what attracted me to go watch the motorcade, was to see Jackie.
Dwight Eisenhower was the oldest president in American history up to this time.
Right.
And Kennedy's stood in stark contrast to the grandfatherly Eisenhowers. At that moment in your life as a young woman, did you recognize that this was a historic transition?
I think we did, yes. I don't know if we could have verbalized it too well, but I think that was our sense of, yes, that we're on the verge of, you know, it was also the start of the whole outer space travel and all these things, and it was just like the civil rights movement starting. It's like we really were on the verge of a whole new world, and I think a lot of us really felt we wanted to be part of it, and he represented that.
Tell me how you came to be at the Dallas Morning News.
Well, I came to be at the Dallas Morning News because I happened to have been offered a job there 2 months before I graduated. And it seemed like too good of an opportunity to pass up, to be right out of college and get a job on a major newspaper. Of course, I was a woman, and naturally I got assigned to women's news department because that's about the only place women went in those days. And so that's how I went. I just simply had applied for a job and gotten it, and that's why I was there.
Let me ask you about women's news for a minute. I know Vivian Castleberry very well from the Times-Herald, and
right.
She, of course, was paving the way for women to cover hard news subjects.
Right.
Well, can you speak to the dynamic between what Vivian was doing over at the Times-Herald and what things were like at the Morning News at that time?
Well, I think at the Morning News, it was a much more maybe conservative and traditional approach. We had women who covered food, and women who covered clubs, and women who covered society and fashion. And, you know, in fact, our office was cut off. It was actually on the 3rd floor and in the same area, but we had partitions where we were kind of separate.
Did the competition I hear about between the reporters at the Morning News and the Times-Herald, did that extend to the women's news? Did you consider them to be your competitors?
Well, I think, yes, everybody considered it to be competitors. I mean, actually, and I really did more. My work at that time was more, did mostly copy and makeup. I did some reporting, which is what I really wanted to do, but I said they just had a need for somebody else to do editing, and I mostly did editing, rewrites, wrote headlines, that kind of stuff around the desk, and I usually got to cover a story mainly if it somehow involved anybody that spoke Spanish, because I spoke Spanish. I was the only person that spoke Spanish. So if there was somebody came in town, like they had the Mexico City Ballet or whatever, I wound up covering it. But I spent most of my time around the desk, so I didn't get that involved with any rivalries. I did have one interesting, sort of hard news story. It didn't really develop, but it was the first week I was, excuse me, there. A plane was hijacked to Cuba, and they wanted to get in touch with Castro. So if you would believe it, I was at that point probably a couple of weeks out of college. And the whole Dallas Morning News, I was the only one they found that could speak Spanish. So they put me on the phone, sitting out in the city desk, to Castro. And we actually got through to his office and spoke to somebody there. Never got him on the phone personally. But that was my big brush with hard news.
My goodness. And to be so new on the job, that must have been exciting.
Oh, it was amazing. In fact, Jack Beer is a photographer who shot the famous picture of Lee Harvey Oswald being shot. He took my picture on that on the phone talking to Castro's office, and I still have it framed in my house. It's my kid's favorite picture.
Characterize the political atmosphere in Dallas at the time.
Well, it was there was definitely it was a very conservative town. I would say right wing, not the extreme right wings that we see now, but it was a right wing town, and I was very much somewhat out of my element because I had been born a bleeding heart liberal, and I didn't fit in too well with most of my companions or friends, but it was not a vindictive kind of things. I just was different, and it was very conservative. And I know I went to the also where Adlai Stevenson, the event where I'm sure you remember that, where Adlai Stevenson was things were thrown at him as he was entering the hotel in Dallas. So there had been a lot of stuff, and of course that infamous ad in the newspaper, I've always believed that did more than anything to give Dallas the stigma it's had for so long, because I went abroad shortly after that, to live, a year after that, to live, and people had terrible feelings about Dallas, and I think a lot of that was due to that ad.
And that, of course, was your newspaper. Do you feel any sense of guilt or frustration because it was your paper?
No, I mean, I think it was a terrible mistake, and I'm sorry they did such a thing, but I've heard since that the editor said, who charged that, said he was out or something, would have never approved it. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it certainly was not something that should have run, and certainly not on the day the president was appearing, and not in a city that had already had some overtones of not being too welcoming. So
I think I mentioned to you that about 10 years ago I interviewed Ann Donaldson at the time,
right.
Later Ann Hatterberry.
Right.
Now, the two of you were roommates?
We were roommates, yes.
Okay, where were you living?
We lived in the Continental House Apartments, right off the Central Expressway, and then we later moved to a place on Cedar Springs.
And did you commute together to work every day?
No, we commuted because Ann did a lot of reporting, going out with the car, so we didn't commute together to work, but we
Let me get you some water.
Came in at the same time every day.
Let's talk about that day. Do you remember the moment when you found out that Kennedy was coming, there was going to be a motorcade?
I found that we knew for several days he was coming, and we knew there was going to be a motorcade, and that was a lot of the big question mark was whether or not they would have the bubble top, because I guess mainly the weather they were concerned about. But anyhow, and the night before I was very excited. I mean, in the article that's in the book that Dallas News put out about, I gave myself a manicure and to try to decide what dress I wanted to wear because I wanted to look really nice. Not that I thought he would particularly, but it's just somehow in my mind that when you go see the president, even if it's in that kind, you sort of show some respect by dressing and looking your best. So I paid a lot of attention to how I looked and what I wore. And I wasn't too sure because I said most of my friends were not necessarily politically aligned as I was. I didn't know if anybody would go with me, but I got 3 people to go.
Yeah, the 4 of you all became well-known eyewitnesses to the assassination.
Yes.
Run down the list, if you would, just for the record. Besides you and Ann Donaldson Atterbury, who else was there?
Maggie Brown. Can't remember what her married name. Maggie Brown, she was then. And Aurelia Alonso. I also don't know her married name.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier Maggie's deceased.
Yes, Maggie's deceased and Ann is deceased. And I don't know about Aurelia. I wish I did, but I don't know about her whereabouts.
Okay. What can you tell me as far as how you decided to stand in that spot on the north side of Elm?
Well, mainly because we were going for our, we're just going to go down on our lunch hour. And I was very concerned because we really only supposed to have 30 minutes. But I figured it was going to take longer than that. And I was a little bit concerned about the time. And our original intention was to stop in Dealey Plaza. And which because the motorcade came down in front of that and then turned. But by the time we got there, that was already quite crowded. So we looked over across the street. And there was very few people in front of the school book depository building, so we said, we can see much better there. So we just crossed over to the street, and that's how we happened to be in front of the school book depository building.
Do you remember any of the other people around you? Do you have any conversations, or did anyone in particular stand out?
The only I remember, there were a couple of black women. Not too first, and I remember after it happened, them sobbing. But otherwise, we were kind of engrossed in ourselves, and we had quite a bit of conversation, talking there about it, what was coming on, and expressing some concern about the grassy knoll, and saying that looked like a sort of dangerous place, and we didn't see much security there. We were surprised that there wasn't obvious security in a place like that.
So before the assassination, you were commenting on the grassy knoll?
Yes, we were.
What was that in mind because of this political atmosphere? Were you prepared for something to happen?
Oh, no. I mean, it still never crossed my mind that anything would happen. And certainly not at that point, because it was like it was already over and done with. By that point, there were hardly any people compared to what it was, further up where there were huge crowds. There were very few people, and it was really the end of it. And I know it never crossed my mind that anything would happen. And in fact, with the first shot, we thought it was a car backfiring. It wasn't until the second shot that it was obvious what was happening.
Well, walk me through, if you would, just your eyewitness account, and then I'll ask some questions at the end.
Well, and I'm very positive about my eyewitness account that I really believe I got it right. I said the first shot missed. The second shot hit him in the throat area. And I thought, at that point, maybe it was a shot he could survive. The car slowed down almost to a halt. The third shot, I just saw his head explode, and I knew it was fatal, that there wasn't any way he could survive that.
You were watching President Kennedy the entire time?
I was. I honestly did not even know until afterwards that Governor Connally was in the car. My eyes were so fixated on him and Jacqueline Kennedy, I did not even notice that Governor Connally was in the car at that time.
And the shots were all evenly spaced or not?
Pardon?
As far as the spacing between the shots, do you...
Oh, no, absolutely not. There was a pause between the first and the second shot. There was a time for us to discuss it and say, I said I thought it was a car backfiring, and Ann said, I think maybe it's firecrackers. And then I made the comment about, well, that's a very poor taste to do something like that in an event like this. So we had the conversation in between the first and second shot. The second and third shot were very close together. It's like the sound from one didn't vanish before the other one came. So
Of course, you're visible in Abraham Zapruder's home movie of this moment.
Oh, yes.
Tell us, so we can find you in the film, tell us what you were wearing that day, or what color.
I was wearing a gray wool long sleeve dress. It was 2 shades of gray.
And do you remember the line, the order in which you were standing?
I believe I was if you look at it's filmed from the back, of course.
Right.
So looking at us from the back, I was the second from the right.
Okay, and who was on either side of you?
Well, Anne was on one side of me, for sure, and the other side, I believe, was Maggie.
Okay. Were you closest to Anne among that group of friends?
Oh, yeah, because Anne and I were very close. I said she was my maid of honor in my wedding.
Right. Good. I mentioned to you earlier that Anne remembers that moment and remembers that you were certain, absolutely certain, that the president was dead.
Oh, I had no doubt about it. That's when we got to the news. I said, and this was, of course, before they had any word from Parkland or anybody. I said, he's dead. I said, he's either dead or we hope he's dead because he's going to be such a vegetable. His brains have been blown out. And I had no doubt. And I said, I think that's why they asked me to write the story, because everybody else was very vague about it. And I don't know whether it's because they really just didn't see what I saw or if they just couldn't handle it or what. I don't know. But of the 4, I was the only one. And, you know, they didn't know whether to believe me or not. And then they thought, well, maybe we ought to write it down in case she's right, you know. So they had me write the story, and I wrote the story that, you know, that he'd killed him before he was even pronounced dead, because it took a while to get the announcement. It was an hour or so before.
And that story you wrote is very similar to, or exactly what you told me today. You mentioned, of course, in that story that you felt like the shots came from in front of you.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Well, yes, I did say that, and that's something I've regretted for the rest of my life, because every conspiracy theorist in the world has quoted that. And I am convinced that I did not hear it correctly. Number one, I have a hearing problem that I cannot tell the direction of sound. I just can't. I said, we're driving in a car and a siren comes and I go berserk because I don't know where it's coming from. And so that was number one factor, that I did my own hearing disability. Number two, I've heard from a number of people, and then it was also, I just watched Nova this week, and they had experts saying how the sound could be distorted there. So I'm convinced that the sound was distorted. That I believe the shots came from the school book depository building, and I should have never said that, you know. But I did, because it's true. It's what it sounded like. But I don't believe that's where they came from.
You mentioned quite rightly that your account typically groups you with the conspiracy.
I know. It kills me. It kills me, and that's one reason why I've laid very low for 50 years, because it makes me sick being involved with these conspiracy theorists. And the latest one has just really almost broken my heart. It's a book that came out about how the Secret Service driver killed him. And I mean, when they used me as part of the, you know, evidence, it just makes me sick. And I still, when I look on I can't do it very often because I get upset, but, you know, they're saying like the first dissenting witness. And then there was one woman who wrote something and called me a liar, and I had sold out, and I was a disgrace to my profession, and I should be run out of the profession. And all this, I said, you know, that's why I really have not gotten involved with, I haven't written any books, I've done very few things at all, because I just didn't want to get involved with these people.
Take me back to those moments. The assassination has taken place. Can you describe the initial aftermath and anything you observed? I'm sorry, the initial aftermath, right after the shots were fired. What did you see around you?
Oh, well, there was chaos there. There were people hitting the ground. You know, there's that famous picture of the couple covering their child. And I mean, it never occurred. I mean, it's like I was so stunned. And I guess, in truth, the bullets must have gone directly over my head. And maybe we were in danger, you know, in some sense. But it never occurred to me to do anything. I mean, it was just so, like, I can't believe this is happening. And didn't do anything. And then afterwards, of course, people were just stunned, and some people were crying. I particularly remember those couple of black women who were just really beside themselves. And we were all just kind of holding on to each other for a few minutes and seeing there. And then we decided we ought to walk back to the news and let them know what had happened, because of course all their reporters are in a bus in the back or at the Trade Mart or something else doing something important. And, we just happened to be the ones on the spot.
Your reporting that day is remarkably straightforward, considering what you had just witnessed. Do you think it's possible you were in shock?
I don't know, because I don't know really what shock. I don't know how to define shock. I just have always known that I guess I'm a realist. I believe what I see, and I know what I saw, and I just couldn't convince myself of it. I would have liked to have, but I couldn't convince myself of anything else. And I've never felt any remorse about that I think I did get it right. I think I was right, and I think I was a good witness. You used to hear eyewitnesses are really terrible, and I said I think I stood up pretty good as an eyewitness.
What was the rest of your weekend like?
Oh, the rest of my weekend, well, I was heartbroken, and I was very, very close to my family, very, very close to my parents, and I wanted to be with my parents because it's like they knew my involvement in the past, everything leading up to it. As I said, most of the people I knew were not big Kennedy supporters to begin with, and I knew my parents would really understand how I was feeling, not because of what I witnessed, because of what had happened. Not any role I had, but just what had happened. So I stayed late that night, as I said, because I helped with foreign press. And then the next morning I drove home because I wanted to be with my parents. And of course that was Saturday morning. And Sunday, of course, we turned on the TV and there we see Oswald and Ruby. So it was a terrible weekend. It was just one thing compounded on the other, It was like never ending.
Had you ever heard of Jack Ruby prior to all this?
No, I hadn't, although I understand that he once lived in the apartment I lived in. He was not living there at the time, but that he lived in the Continental House apartments. And I don't know, I may have seen him around there, I don't know, but I didn't know him.
Did you cover the Ruby trial in 1964?
Oh no, by 1964 I was on my way to Brazil.
Okay. Yeah, that's right. You joined the Peace Corps, and I want to talk about that.
Yeah.
Before we get to that, though, in the initial aftermath, Dallas became the city of hate, the city of shame.
Oh, it was terrible.
Tell me about any personal experiences you had.
Well, mainly it was the experience I had going abroad. When I got to Brazil, everybody loved John F. Kennedy. Everybody. And I mean from the elite down to, and I worked with people who lived in the worst slums, some of the worst slums in the world. They still knew of John F. Kennedy and they still loved him. And they loved, you're too young to remember, Pope John the 23rd was of that same era, and he had died just a couple years before. Every home you went into in Brazil, there was a picture of John F. Kennedy and Pope John the 23rd. And and they would ask where was I from, and I was from Dallas. They would just be shocked, and they would just look at me like, what kind of devil are you? And I said, it's like as if they expected me to have cloven feet and horns and all this, that, and the other. And I really tried, I did my best, as long as I was there, to try to convince people that that wasn't the true Dallas, that there may have been an element, but it was not, that's not what caused his death, that the person, it was one misguided, I always said it was one misguided misfit that did it. And actually his political leanings were totally the opposite, of what you normally think of as Dallas. So, but it was very, very difficult. And it was not just that way in Brazil, because I traveled all through South America. And then after I got out of the Peace Corps, I traveled for 6 months in Europe, and everywhere in the world. Dallas was just a terrible place, a terrible place.
Did you join the Peace Corps because of the assassination?
No, I said this is I mean, in a way I did, because I had thought about joining the Peace Corps in college, actually, because I said being one of the Kennedy kids, and I had seriously thought about it. But first of all, I did get hired by the Dallas Morning News, which I really wasn't expecting to happen, and that happened, and I thought that was too good of an opportunity to pass up. Plus, my father had not been well, and I was a little bit concerned about leaving the country at that time. So I didn't join it when I got out of college. But it's something I wanted to do, and I think the thing about the assassination that really made me realize for the first time, and I wrote that in the article, you probably read, the whole fragility of life and how you never know if somebody as bright and important and gifted and everything as John Kennedy's life can be snuffed out in a second. All of our lives are uncertain. And I thought I wanted to do certain things. I wanted to travel abroad. I wanted to really live in another culture. I wanted to really learn another language and be really fluent. And so I thought I can stay here, because I was at the point I thought I was very comfortable in a sense in Dallas, and I loved where I was working for the news and the people and all that. But I thought, I could stay here for the next 50 years and not leave. And if I want to do so these things, I better do it. So that's why I joined the Peace Corps. But I had a little interesting experience with that, because the Peace Corps in those days were very, very highly selective. And you had to go through all kinds of psychological evaluation to get approved. And so it turns out I got sent, and I knew I was in trouble, because I got sent to the head psychiatrist at Yale University, had an interview scheduled with me. And so I go in, and the first thing he says to me after good morning or whatever is, "Where were you on November 22nd, 1963? And I mean, I knew in a second, I know where this guy's heading, and I'm going to not let him get the best of me. So I just said, I was in Dallas, Texas. And he said, well, what were you doing around noontime on Dallas, Texas? And I said, oh, I was standing in front of the Texas School Book Depository waiting a motorcade. And then he said, well, what happened? And I said, oh, the president was shot. I thought everybody knew that by now. And then he said, are you sorry it happened? Are you sorry you were there? Are you sorry you were there? And I said, no, I'm not sorry I was there. I'm sorry it happened. I'm not sorry I was there. And I said, had I been alive when Jesus Christ was crucified, I would have been glad to be on the scene to cover it. And so I wasn't deselected. So I guess they decided I was not, there assuaging my guilt for it. So I did not join the Peace Corps because of that reason, but it did, in a sense, because it made me think about what I wanted to do with my life.
How soon after the assassination were you contacted by researchers and book authors?
Well, some right away, some of them. Mark Lane was after me right away. What's his face? Garrison in New Orleans. He was after me. He kept after me for years, literally years after I was married and living in New York. I was still getting stuff from him.
Did you cooperate?
Oh, no. I personally never spoke to them. Mark Lane kept really calling me at the news, and finally, Mr. Kruger, who was the managing editor at the time, said, don't worry about it, you don't have to talk to him. And if you need a lawyer, the Dallas Morning News has fine lawyers.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he had no reason to have to, that I had to talk to him. So I never did.
Has that interest persisted over these 5 decades?
What interest?
The interest in your story, researchers contacting you.
Oh, every once in a while, but mostly I've been hard to find. I think, in fact, they were telling me at the news they were trying to find, couldn't find me, and it was sort of serendipitous how they found me. Is because my daughter contacted them because I'd been in California visiting her and said, oh, I see they're having this thing in Dallas, and David McCullough is going to be the guest speaker. I said, oh, he's my favorite author. I'd love to meet David McCullough. And so my daughter contacts the Dallas Dallas Morning News and says, hey, my mom is so-and-so, and she's interested in coming to this, and that's how. But most people don't know where I am or how, and I live in upstate New York part of the year, in Mexico the other part, so they don't get a hold of me too easily.
This whole year has been an opportunity for Dallas to really reflect, and of course you're here today, one day shy of the half-century mark of this, in this not too far from the spot you stood 50 years ago. What's it like for you to come back here?
It's sort of hard in a way, but I have my children and my nieces. It's amazing. They all wanted to come. That was the whole impetus. They wanted to kind of relive the experience through me. And it's like I was the living, guide to what had happened. And they wanted to actually see it as I had gone through it. And so my daughter is the one who got contacted the Dallas Morning News and how this whole thing started, that I wound up being here, because I never would have done it on my own. And I'm glad. It's been a very worthwhile experience, and Will over at the news has been just absolutely wonderful to me and just treated me with such respect and kindness and all. So it's been a good experience, and I like to. I said I believe that it's very important to pass these things on to future generations, and I'm glad that I'm able to do that through my daughter and my nieces who are here, and even my little grandchildren. Of course, they're too young, but it's amazing. My little 4-year-old grandson can recite almost the whole history because they've told him about it. So,
is there anything we haven't talked about today that you'd like to add to the record?
I don't think so. I guess the one thing I'd like to say is that I'm just happy that Dallas is, I think, finally, maybe this will be a big step to overcoming that stigma that has plagued the city for so many years. I think that maybe people are seeing a new side of Dallas for what it really is, and I think that's a positive thing to come from this. And I just think it's important that we do remember. I think we never should forget what happened here, ever.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking time today while you're here to share a few thoughts with me. We appreciate it.
Thank you.